right, so for today's tutorial, we're going to take a peek at painting this floral scene. So we've got a bright blue background and we've got some poppies in the foreground, also some purple flowers, and we've got some like little golden buds that are coming up in the background as well. And it seems like we're from a perspective that's slightly lower, looking up into the sky, which for watercolors helps us a lot because these flowers here that are along the horizon instead of stuck inside the greenery are going to be a lot easier to paint. So that's kind of why I chose this reference photo to paint. Now I am working on a cold pressed Arches 140 gram paper, or 140 pound paper, excuse me. And I don't have any sort of outline already traced onto my paper. The reason why is because I'm going to be doing my first layer wet on wet and having some of my colors spread in that wetness, and having a tracing an outline or drawing on where some of these flowers might go then kind of restricts where I can see these flowers happening. If I simply use a plain sheet of paper and drop my colors, if they expand a little bit more than what I'm expecting, I can make that flower just slightly larger. If it stays within its boundaries, I can make that one a little bit smaller. And so we have a little bit more variability. Now, that being said, then we need to look at our reference photo as simply a reference photo to help guide us. But the water and how the water is interacting with the paint is really going to be what we're looking at. So we have to kind of have that mindset that the painting might not look exactly like our reference photo, and our reference photo is just a guide. Okay, so other supplies that I'm using, I'm going to be using a variety of round brushes. So there's a size 4 and a size 8. These are silver limited black velvet. I am going to be using a rigger, also known as a liner or a script brush. It has these long bristles. It's a smaller sized brush, either a 0 or a 1. I'll be using that for some of the smallest of these grasses and stems. I do really suggest that you practice with a liner rigger. This is a great project to practice with to create some of these really nice, fine, tiny lines. And then I'm also going to be using a large mop brush or a quill brush. This is a large quill brush. I'll use that for wetting my entire background. You might also, I'm not sure if I'm going to be using it, but you might also want to keep a spray bottle on hand in case you need to re-wet your paper at all. And then 2 cups of water, since we will need to be working quickly. If 1 cup gets stained and tinted by that red, I can quickly switch it out with a different cup of water. My colors here are all Daniel Smith. Since I'm painting this free and I have not practiced painting this before, I'm not sure exactly which colors I will choose, but a variety of colors of different shades of red, blues, purples, things like that. And then of course your greens is going to be helpful. All right, so before I get started, I always like to take a peek at my reference photo and somewhat plan it out. So obviously I want to do my first layer wet on wet. I'm going to start with my bright blue background and sky. I do want to make sure that the sky comes into where the greenery is, but that it's the most dark up top. And I noticed some clouds in the background. I might add more clouds in the background there just to add a little bit more contrast. But I think I am going to stick just with the blues. I don't know if I want to add any extra colors in the background there since we've got some really nice florals. Now, while it's still wet, I want to drop in some color of where my flowers, my colored flowers will go. And so I want to mix up my red, purple, my kind of periwinkle purple color and my pinks there. And I want to mix them in a fairly opaque consistency with not a lot of water so that I can have those colors stay more or less where I put them on the wet paper. I might also drop in some green gold for some of these buds at the top. I have been debating on if I wanted to do wet on wet in the foreground or in the grasses down below. I think though what I'm gonna try, and it might not work, but I think I'm gonna try doing the grasses in my second step, wet on dry. That way I can have them be a little bit more precise. So we'll start out by getting our colors ready. So we'll get some water here. So my poppy color, that red poppy color there, let's mix that first. So I do have a red on my sheet, but this Pyrrole Scarlet is a very, very intense color. I think that's gonna be great for my poppies. And then I think I also want to at least get this anthracnose red wet. So I'm wetting down the scarlet and also my red. When I'm working wet on wet, I'll drop in some of this watered down color and then add some more opaque color on top. For where they connect with their stems, I want to drop in a violet. So I'm gonna drop in a carbazole violet at the base of the stem there and watch it bloom upwards. Now, I might not get the opportunity to do that wet on wet. That might be a second layer, but I'm gonna see how fast things go. This blue color I do need to mix as well because I do not have that kind of blue periwinkle color, bluish purple color already in my palette. So I've got a blue here, and then I will add a little bit of this carbazole violet. It is leaning more violet than blue. So I am gonna add quite a bit of this carbazole violet until I get to a point where it's looking a little bit more violet. Now I will most likely be doing the layers that are on top of this are going to be more purple. So I'm okay with it leaning a little bit more blue to start. Once again, this is a fairly opaque, I still have water, but it's kind of like a honey consistency. It's not very watered down, which I need that honey consistency or otherwise it's going to spread profusely. With the green gold, I'm not going to mix that. I'm just going to add a few drops on top of my green gold just to get it softened up and ready to go. And then for my sky color, I can either use my phthalo blue or I also have this cerulean blue, which I think I'm gonna do a cerulean blue and then probably drop in a little bit of phthalo blue on top. All right, so let's get started. We're gonna start by wetting our whole paper. And like I said, I'm gonna start with my sky color first. So wetting my paper is going to be the most important part of this step. I wanna make sure that it's wet enough and that I give it enough time for that water to soak in. So I'm not gonna be wetting it really quickly and then all of a sudden starting to paint. I do wanna give that water. So I did wet the whole thing, but if I were to start painting right now, it might end up drying a little bit too quickly. I want to give that water a little bit more time to soak into the paper. And so to do that, I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to go back to the start. Let's have a little fluff on the paper. I'm going to go back to the start. I'm going to re-wet everything. I might go back and add a little bit more water. And now I'm tilting my head to the left and to the right, kind of lowering it, making sure that I have an even consistency of wetness. And now that I've gone over it a few times, I've allowed it a little bit more time to soak into the paper. Now I should be ready for my blues. So using the same quill brush, I'm gonna grab some of that blue. Make sure to slightly mix the color on your palette so that you don't get any dark blue streaks. If we don't touch to the palette first, that's where we might get these dark blue streaks on our paper. I'm gonna start at the edges, and where I see these clouds in the center, I'm going to grab my blue, bring it inward, but then I might be leaving a little section of paper to just kind of shine through. Now I know that my color is going to spread more than what I'm expecting. So I don't want to overwork that area. And I do want to bring the blue. You see how I'm starting to carry the blue all the way down with whatever blue is left on my brush, because I don't want any hard edges on this blue, but I also don't want that dark of a blue near my greens. Now before this dries, I'm going to take a little bit of that phthalo blue, which is a little bit more intense of a blue, and I'm going to come towards this skyline. Add a little bit more of that darker blue at the very top. You know, I want to see what it's like to add a little bit of this more purple color that I mixed originally for the flowers. Kind of like how that's looking actually. So I might add it on both sides. Kind of gives a little bit more variety in the sky. I don't want to overly mix because the water is going to help me do that. If you got any sort of too hard of edges, or if you're starting to see spidering from that water, so spidering, these little like spider veining of the water there, you can dry your brush, clean it first, and then dry it off. And use a somewhat dry brush, very lightly tap to soak up around those edges, just to soften them up a little bit. Don't press down too hard with that dry brush, or otherwise you are going to soak up too much and then create a hard edge there. All right, now I'm not worried about adding any greenery down here, but I do want to start placing some of my flowers. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. Now this is where we have this color here, but it is still mixed slightly with water. And so because there's a lot of water on my size 4 brush, I'm going to tap it first on my paper towel, release some of that, and then I'm going to go in where I want some of these flowers, and I have a little bit more control where this color goes. So I'm gonna add some flowers in this white area. The more that I tap down with my brush, the more that it's gonna spider vein out. Different sections of my paper have different wetnesses, so even though I'm painting the same thing in different places around my paper, it's going to react differently depending on how wet that section is. If it's blooming too much, that means that you have too much liquid on your brush that you're incorporating into your painting, and then you're gonna want to grab a little bit of pigment directly from your pan instead of mixing it with water first. Now here I'm just trying to kind of place out where these flowers will be and how big they're gonna be. I can add a few in the foreground that's going to be covered, surrounded by the greenery. And another one right there. Now my paper is still quite wet, and so I'm not worried about having enough time. I can already tell though that at some of the corners here that it is starting to dry a little bit. So I'm gonna stop with those, and now I'm going to switch colors to these bright blue purples. Same thing, I might have too much liquid on my brush since this is quite watered down. I'll tap it first, and then I'm gonna add some of these dots. And I'm just at this point, like I said, I'm just kind of figuring out where are these clumps of flowers going to be. I can add more, so I know there's a lot of these like bluish flowers on this left side. I can always add a few more on this right side to help balance it out. This is where I'm not looking at my reference photo as an exact replica, but I'm using it as a general guide. Now here's where you're gonna be seeing a lot of this spidering effect. I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna fix that once I get all my colors down. I do notice a few of these pink poppies or pink flowers. I don't know if those are still poppies. So I'm gonna use an opera pink. Add a little bit of opera pink there, maybe another one here. And then before it dries, I wanted to add a little bit of that green gold. Now this green gold is a very pushy color, so I do want to keep it fairly opaque, or fairly like honey consistency, so it's not, I'm not adding a lot of water. And now I'm going to add just some little of my green gold, little blobs here. This green gold is an awesome color for adding accents like this, especially on top of sections that I've already painted blue or other colors, because it is kind of a bully color that pushes these other colors out of the way. Now you'll notice that I am adding a few little stems coming out of these. If I had a little bit more water with this green gold, and I dropped in a little bit more watered down green gold, you're gonna notice a lot more of that blooming effect. And so with some of these that I want a little bit larger, I added a little bit more water, and then I'm kind of dotting that watered down bubble. I add a few over here just to even it out a little bit so that it's not just these are the only ones. All right, and then before I let this all dry, I do want to use a dry brush and kind of clean up some of those edges, especially on my flowers. Now that my paper is starting to dry just a little bit, I can clean my brush off, dry it, and use a dry brush to just kind of clean up some of those spidering edges. Now I still want to do this cleanup while my paper is still wet, so I'm still seeing that it's nice and shiny, which means that it's nice and wet still. If I try to clean up these veining edges as it's drying, it's going to be a lot more challenging, and it's going to make it look like there's almost like a halo around your color, because you're lifting up color and you're not allowing it to still soak slightly. So I'm gonna clean up that those spidering edges. I'll clean up a little bit of the spidering edges with the poppies. Then if I still have time, which it looks like I still have a little bit of time before this layer dries, I can go back and I can drop in more dark pigment. So this would need to be pigment directly from my wells instead of mixed with water. I really definitely do not want to accidentally drop in any liquid at this point, or otherwise it's going to make it a little bit more detrimental than helpful. So here I'm just trying to kind of add a little bit of this underbelly to these poppies. Now, if I'm noticing extremely hard edges, this is probably where I would want to stop, and I don't want to add any extra color. I still want this first layer to be really nice and soft. So you're gonna have to really just take a peek at your own painting and the wetness of the painting that you're doing. And if you still have time to add a little bit of these shadows, you can. If you don't have time though, you can add it as your next layer, wet on dry. Like I said, I might see what it's like to add just a little bit of purple at the base. Spidering out quite a bit. And that pink. You might be surprised at how much time you actually have. And now I just want to take a little peek at the purple. So I'm going to grab a little of that Carbazole Violet. And I do want to add just a few hints of that deeper purple there. All right, and then I think I want to let it dry. I want to try to avoid overworking this first layer. The more pigment that I place down, the more you risk having hard edges in places that you don't want them. So I do want to leave this as being kind of more of this very soft background, and then I'll add my other colors on top. So we'll let this dry for just a little bit and then we'll come back. All right, so I left my wet on wet to dry overnight. I wanted to make sure that it was thoroughly dry before I started on my second layer. And so you can see just how much lighter that, that color is once you allow it to dry. So now we're going to start working on our second layer of color, and that's going to be our wet on dry. So this time we're not wetting our paper first. We're going to mix our color using water, and then we're going to paint our color on top. Now I don't need to be exact with my lines, with my edges here, because I do kind of want a somewhat whimsical painting, so I don't need to go over these edges. I can allow some of that color to flow naturally outside of the edges. This is a stage that if you had wanted to, you can just do wet on wet without drawing, or you can take a pencil, and if you feel more comfortable, you can do kind of a pencil outline with your flowers. So I'm going to start with the flowers that I for sure want in my painting. So I'm going to start with my my peonies, or sorry, not peonies, my poppies. I'm gonna do a kind of uneven edge around the outside and bringing it into the center here. And now I'm gonna fill this all in. Now from this, I can always do a little bit of wet on wet. So here at the base where I had dropped that violet, I can always drop a little bit more into this base here. I can always take a peek at the edges of my poppy, and I can add a little bit of that Pyro Scarlet directly from my pan, or a little bit of that Anthraquinoid Red on the edge. I can always drop in a little bit of Gamboge on a highlight. So I can kind of do a few different things of dropping in and lifting, dropping in highlights, dropping in shadows. And then I think too, while I'm at it, while I'm doing each of these these flowers, I'm gonna pull the stem right away so that it kind of, so that the colors are starting to bleed just slightly. So I'm going to touch my colors there, pull my stem. If there are other flowers that are kind of in the way here, I can leave a little opening. Now, most likely this is going to be covered up by a lot of other greens and grasses, but at least I've got kind of the trajectory of this one. All right, so we're going to continue on the same way with all of our poppies. Now I can always make a few different petals for each poppy. So I can either do this type of poppy where it's just kind of the one umbrella, or I can make a little break almost in the petals and have two petals, or even more shapes to that. The one thing that I do want to keep is this consistent kind of fan shape. It's going to give me a really good vantage point, because of course we are kind of looking up from below. And so I don't want to change that all too much, but I can add more than one petal if I would like. then I'm gonna do the same thing for my pink poppies. I'm gonna use this opera pink, and then I might drop in either some quinacridone magenta or also some purple for kind of those shadows. Now for this pink, I might also lift up in some of those areas where you see some really bright highlights. Here's my quinacridone magenta. Now, because of this kind of more whimsical, loose style, I'm not worrying if I have a few sections here that touch and where the colors are bleeding. I'm not worried about that. However, if you don't want those colors to touch, make sure that you leave them to dry. In addition, I'm also not worried if there's some background color that's shining through. I actually appreciate how that looks. And so I'm definitely not worried about that. Some of these stems, I do want to make sure that I'm having some of these stems, whoops, that they intertwine together, that it's not just, you know, vertical stems here. All right, and now let's take a peek at some of the purple flowers. So we're gonna do the second layer on the purple flowers. So I'm going to mix that. That is going to be, I think I'm gonna use just a Sol Carbazole Violet. And then of course I can always drop in additional colors, but remember that we did add a little bit of blue underneath. So if I just have my purple on top, I'm okay with that. Now for these flowers, when we take a peek at them, they're just kind of clumps with bristles or petals that are a little bit more jagged. I can either attempt my best to mimic that, or I can just turn them into more like lavender, if you will. So if I were to do more jagged, I would keep my brush upward and I would kind of create almost like a bubble like that. I think I would do different sizes. So this one is almost too perfect for me. I don't really like how that looks. When I'm doing flower paintings, I'm really looking at the different sizes. And so I don't want to make anything that's the same size as these poppies, or otherwise it's gonna kind of steal the show from the poppies. So I think I'm gonna try to keep these ones a little bit smaller, if you will. And I'm gonna do them more similarly to how I paint lavender. So I'm gonna add some of these vertical hash marks. And then before it dries, I'm gonna grab some of my sap. Oops, I didn't clean my brush well enough. I'm gonna grab some of my sap green that has turned slightly darker in color on me. That's okay. Oh, that's why. That's not sap green. That's deep sap green. So I'm gonna grab my sap green, which is there. And then from this sap green, I can pull while it's wet, and I can kind of attach some of these. And I'm not worried on if they're running into the purple. I actually like how that looks. It gives it a much more watercolor effect. And then I can lift color out if it got to be a little bit too dark. I can also lift some of these hard edges if I don't like the shape of any of them. So like this one, I'm not too fond of the shape of, so I'm gonna use a dry brush to just kind of lift some of that edge off. And then of course I'm remembering that this is my first layer, and so I can always add more on top later. And then I can always add more of these purple flowers if I wanted to balance something out. So I know I have my kind of background wet on wet that's guiding me, but remember that we're now, instead of looking at where all these purple flowers are placed, we're using our reference for a photo just as a guideline for colors, for kind of background shape, for the shape of the flowers, but then we can always add our own touch. I'm gonna add in a few more here, maybe another one down here. And now before it dries, I wanna add in, you see how nicely that kind of mixes together? It gives it a whole nother look compared to just the purple. And so before it dries, I'm gonna pull some stems through. Oftentimes when you're painting loose florals, such as these, when you don't draw out the shape behind, you do look for kind of this mixing of colors. You also are not necessarily looking for any of your lines to necessarily connect. So some of these stems that are coming through aren't necessarily connecting to the flower there. So I'm coming back and I'm dotting in a little bit of extra purple at the base there. And we'll continue on adding a few more purple flowers throughout the piece. Move on to some of these bright kind of golden buds or flowers. I don't really know if they're buds or flowers, what are they, or if they're grasses. But remember we had used green gold for those. So I think I'm gonna switch out my water, use a different new water here so that I don't taint that color at all. So I'll grab some water. I am gonna mix my green gold with some water here. Now to this green gold, I think I'll drop in either a sap green or a deep sap green if I want shadows anywhere. So I'm gonna start with some of these, but then I'm also going to take a peek at the poppy buds. So I think it's really pretty when you have these poppy buds that are like this cocoon egg shape. And then you've got the stem that kind of comes up and around and down. And so I think I'm going to also add quite a few of those within the painting as well. So I'm gonna try to keep a similar structure, where I've got a lot of these tall ones here. And it looks like from when I just zoom in, it looks like they're just little balls attached to a main stem. So we'll see if this looks good, and if not, we'll kind of pivot. So I'll start maybe with painting one of these little stems here. And then from that, some of these balls kind of attached onto these stems. Now this is going to be automatically a different transparency, so I'm not too concerned with it being that opaque. I'm keeping it nice and watery because I know that when the water dries, it's gonna leave kind of like a little ring around this object. And then I'm also not all too concerned if these little ball-shaped things do not connect to one of these stems. A lot of these background flowers are to give you just the hint that there are things there. And if we connect them too much, then our brain, we don't allow our brain to look at the whole piece. Then it's just looking at one of these pieces. And so we're gonna kind of not make these connections because I want my focus to be more on the poppies. See how you couldn't really even see them when you started putting your color down, and now that it's starting to soak into your paper, now you can see them much better. All right, and then I might take a peek at doing just a few of these buds that kind of I'm gonna add, so there's this little bud, right? And then from this, you've got the stem up, and it's this very thin and then to that, I'll add some of my green gold. Kind of lift a little on the top. I don't want these to get too dark. I can always add in a second layer. All right, so at this point I've got my first layer of my flowers down, and now I want to start to struggle with the greens in the front. Now, there are a few ways to do this as a watercolor artist. We did not add a bunch of green in the beginning. We didn't wet a bunch of green during wet on wet. I did that because I wanted to be able to see individual stems. And so now we have a few options. We can either paint the sections in between and then pull some additional grasses up, leaving some of these stems negatively painted, or we can just cover the front with lots of additional greens, and they'd have to be darker. So it would look very different if you just covered with the dark greens in the front. You're not gonna have any of these like lighter greens popping out. You would just have dark greens in front. And so I'm gonna try, I haven't tried this technique before, so it might not work very well and I might hate it, but I'm gonna try it. So what I would like to try is I would like to try adding some wet on wet in between and then using a rigger brush, so keeping it really low, the wet on wet, and then using a rigger brush to pull some of my darker strands up. But that's gonna allow me to go around some of these smaller stems that I just painted. And I'm hoping that it'll give me an effect that I'm wanting. So I have my sap green here. I'm gonna actually mix a little bit of deep sap green. And so we'll just see how this works. I don't know if this is gonna work or not. So what I'm thinking is I add deep sap green to the top, to the front. I get a really nice close contact with some of these smaller stems here. I keep the top really nice and watery. And now from here, I'm going to switch to my rigger brush with my deep sap green, and I'm going to use this puddle that's here to pull some grasses up. I'm not gonna worry if I've got some splatter here. Now the hardest part is gonna be this line here. How do you make sure that this line doesn't look too jagged and kind of almost on purpose? So you're just gonna have to start small, so start down below, and then you're gonna automatically have sections that you're gonna fill in because it's just not gonna look right, okay? Now I would suggest that some of these longer riggers that you're pulling, these longer scripts that you're pulling, that you can continue to pull up and then just try to go, in between. Some can go on top, but the majority should go behind at least your big flowers here. So here's what one section would look like. While that's still wet, you can use a different brush other than your rigger. You can drop in some darks. You can also see what it would look like to drop in a little bit of that lighter green. You can also see what it would look like to drop in a little bit of purple, because remember, we've got our darkest of colors in this purple, and so our purple mixes really nicely with that sap green. So I'm gonna continue working here on little sections. We'll see how it turns out. Like I said, I'm not sure if it's gonna turn out. I think I'll probably do some splatter at the bottom as well to kind of connect everything. But I'm gonna keep these two brushes first with this round size 4 where I'm kind of filling in, and then with my rigger brush where I'm adding a little bit of grasses on top. So these ones that kind of don't have any sort of opening in the top, I might just fill these in. And And then at the very end, I'm gonna go in the front and kind of go over a few strokes in the front here. But these sections that are open towards the top, those are the sections that I wanna add my rigger brush to. The other thing that I'm slightly looking at is the shape of the overall painting. So I've got kind of this triangular coming to more of a peak in the center. And so on the outside, I'm trying to have these grasses kind of stay slightly lower. They might not come up all as far as in the center of the piece. And then I'm also going over these outer stems and leaving the stems in the center as the ones that are standing out. And I'm hoping that'll give me a little bit more distance. It'll give the illusion that this is your focal point, and towards the outside edges of the painting, that's where your vision starts to get a little bit more blurred out. One of the key kind of takeaways to using this rigger brush that I'm quickly becoming aware of as I do more and more paintings using these rigger, also known as script or liner brushes, is that you really do need to completely load your brush. The more liquid you have on your brush, the better your lines are. So for example, this line is broken because of the texture of the paper, because there wasn't enough liquid on the brush when I made that line. I'm also noticing as I'm painting this piece that I'm enjoying adding some curves to these grasses, and I think it's bringing a lot of interest to the piece by having a lot of these curved lines. I like how these curves are looking a lot more than these dashes coming out, and so I think I might incorporate more of those to just kind of give the piece more of a shape. So having a curve like that, and you see how this looks very like rough and jagged, but if I can bring a curve around, then suddenly it makes it look a little bit more organic. And so I think this is one of those times where, you know, you just end up, as you're painting, you're noticing certain things, and kind of taking note of how it feels in your piece and your painting, and making kind of little corrections as you go and little changes as you go, so that it ends up feeling a little bit more natural. Another slight takeaway that I am finding with doing this technique with grasses in the foreground is that it actually it looks nicer the more grasses that you can include, especially in this edge where you filled it in, and then you want to make sure that it doesn't look too awkward at the edge there. The more grasses that you can pull from that base, the more natural it's going to look. Now it's looking way too one color over here, so remember we gotta drop in before it dries Drop in some of our lighter greens. And then also some of our purple. Purple along the base, particularly, making sure that we've got some good different tones in there, some darks and some lights. All right, so I know it'll take a little bit of time for these grasses to dry, and so I'm gonna go back and see if I wanna add a whole nother layer onto my flowers. So I'm gonna switch out my water quickly, grab a new paper towel. So this new layer of my flowers, this is gonna be my last layer. And so this last layer is going to be still wet on wet, and it's going to be my, my details. So this is where if you see any of the folds of the flower petals, that's kind of what I'm looking to include. So let's grab a new paper towel here. So for my poppies, I'm gonna use my Pyrrole Scarlet. And then I'm gonna mix it with just a little bit of my anthracenoid red. Now when I'm doing my my wet on wet layer on top of this wet on, or my wet on dry on top of this wet on wet, my opacity doesn't have to be that dark. So it doesn't have to be that opaque. So it may look similar to the opacity that's already on your paper, but remember that we already painted a section here. And so we don't want to have the second layer of detail be too contrasted compared to what we already painted. So I'm going to start by adding a little bit of line around the outer edge. And then from that, I can pull some lines in from the center. And then I can also add some darkness along that base. And then do the same thing and pull some lines out. Some of these lines are thicker than others. So I've got that really thick line there, and then I've got another one there. But this is just, all this is doing is it's giving a little extra dimension. Now to that stem, I have that purple, and now I might pull a little bit of purple down just to kind of highlight that that's the stem. If I wanted to, I can always add a little bit of purple on the edge of some of these poppies. So you can see that there's a little bit of dark edge on some of these as well, or there's a little dark edge along the base here. It really is kind of your preference if you want to, how light and vibrant you want to keep these. All right, so let's continue adding some detail to this second layer. these purple flowers. I'm just adding just a little extra purple in the center. So I'm not doing this, I'm not taking a lot of time to do this. I'm just adding a little extra detail here in the centers. See, you can always see about adding like a little shadow almost to these little balls, but I don't even think that's necessary. I don't even think I want to add more to those. I just don't want to distract from everything else that's happening. All right, so the last thing that I think I want to do before I finish up this piece is I want to take another look at the foreground because it's looking like it's a little disjointed. Now, some of this is dried here. I'm going to add some grasses going along the top here, and I want those to be the darkest that I can get them. So I'm going to be using my deep sap green, and then I might actually add some indigo to it as well so that it's a little bit darker of a green. And then this is what I'm going to be using. Now, just because I say opaque does not mean that there's not a lot of water. You still need to have quite a lot of water so that you can have these nice long strokes. Otherwise, if you don't have enough water, then you're going to have a little bit more jagged because you're going to see the texture of the paper. All right, so now on top, I'm going to see what it's like to add some extra dark on top of everything, on top of even the base. So this is, I'm not watering down. Now what I'm doing here is I'm having some go this way, having some go this way. I just want to create more chaos. I'm not worried about going on top of flowers, on top of stems here. It is going to look very intense before I take the tape off. Because of course you've got all of these jagged edges on the bottom of the tape. This is kind of one of those times in watercolors where you just have to trust the process and hope that it turns out. And if it doesn't, it's a learning experience. And then I think the last thing that I'm wanting to do is just add a little bit of splatter. Splatter to a painting like this is going to do a few things. One, it's going to connect all of my different layers because I do have background, foreground, immediate foreground. I've got light, I've got dark, I've got kind of a little bit of everything. And so adding some splatter is going to help to combine all these different layers. And then it's also going to create a little bit more movement and motion for my painting. Now with splatter, I do want to have a dark color to splatter with. So here I'm gonna have my deep sap green. I might actually mix it with some purple to make kind of this deep purple color. And I keep my splatter kind of towards the bottom. I like holding it in my non-dominant hand. I'm gonna take a different brush and the end of a different brush and just add a little bit of splatter towards the base. I can have a little bit of splatter coming up towards the top, but I also want to be aware that I don't want too much here up in the top. So I'm gonna try to keep it more along the base. right, and we'll let that dry and we'll see if we need to add any extra details. All right, and then the last thing here, I'm gonna just see what it's like to kind of outline some of these flowers that I want to be in the center of my painting. So I'm gonna outline them a little bit with a black micron pen. I don't need to be very accurate with this. I'm just wanting to kind of get a little bit of definition around the outside of these petals. See what it looks like with the tape taken off.